For this exercise, before we get started, you should have already had access to the caricature reference photographs. I've asked you to go ahead and set aside one of the photographs to use as your project. So for this exercise, I want you to pick another photograph to use as a practice in learning how to use Illustrator to create an outline sketch. I'm going to go ahead and set this one aside to use for today's exercise. Before we get started, let's go down to Adobe Illustrator and launch Adobe Illustrator. And once it's launched, let's go up to File and create a new document. Just like in Photoshop, we need to establish the size and dimensions for our document. Do make sure you're working in inches, and we want this to be a 10 by 10 inch area. We only need one artboard, and for now we don't necessarily need any bleed settings for this. Under your advanced settings, do make sure your color mode you're working in is going to be RGB, and we'll keep all of the raster effects and everything else by their default setting. From here we can say create. This will give us our new document to be able to work in. For this exercise, you can either use your blob brush tool, which is located underneath your paintbrush tool, or you can use your pencil tool, which is located underneath your shaper tool. This depends on the type of tablet that you use and your style of preference for drawing. Also be aware, there is a known issue for using Wacom versus other off-brand tablets and the pressure sensitivity for Adobe Illustrator. To find out more about that, see my quick tips tutorial on how to set up Adobe Illustrator so that you can use a non-Wacom tablet in Illustrator. If you do have the blob brush tool, you can double click on the preferences and the size of your brush that I recommend, it will be about 10 points. Make sure pressure sensitivity is turned on and set your variation all the way up to 10 point as well. This will give you good thick and thin lines as you draw off. If you're not going to use the blob brush, you can still do everything with the pencil tool. You can double click on it. For this exercise, I'm going to keep the fidelity closer to the smoother end, maybe not 100% smooth. And we're going to turn off filling new strokes, keeping selected, and also the option key toggles this to the smooth tool. Everything else can be checked on. We'll say OK with this. Finally, with the pencil tool selected, we're going to set our stroke profile to be the width profile number 1. Later on we can change out the width of our stroke as well. But also go over to your appearances panel and make sure that new art has basic appearance is unchecked. With that unchecked, now you should be able to draw and keep the same line as you draw with the pencil tool. We'll delete away everything. The next thing we need to do is to place our artwork. Let's go up to File, down to Place, and locate the caricature that you want to be able to work on. In my case, it'll be this one. Before I say Place, make sure you can see the options down at the very bottom, and what we want to be able to do is to bring this in as a template layer. When we say Place Now, this will place it right in the middle of your document, and check out your Layers panel. This brings in a layer that's a new template layer that's underneath your drawing layer. By default, it is locked down, and I want to make some changes to it, so I'm going to unlock that layer. Choose your selection tool, your black arrow, and let's make it a little bit larger so that I can mainly focus in on his face. That looks good for there. Also from here, I may want to bump up the opacity of it. By default, it tends to drop the opacity and makes it a little bit lighter to sketch on top of. For me, I want to be able to change this, so I'm going to double click on the icon itself. This will bring up my layer options. Here they are here. And then I can tell it to dim the image, maybe not by 50%, but let's bump it up to about 75%. And we'll say OK to that. Now we can return to our Layers panel and lock down that layer. And I'm going to rename our default layer 1 or layer 2 as our tracing layer. Everything that we do will be done inside of this traced layer. Now for this tracing, we want to create a general outline of all the major parts of our character's face. What we don't want to do is to have any kind of tonal values. Basically, I just want to be able to redraw him only using lines. To do this, we're going to zoom in on just each individual key part. In this case, I enjoy working a little bit closer to my subject than I would if I was working in Photoshop. And again, using whichever tool you want, we're going to do a basic outline of each of the features. Since I am doing a tracing, another thing I get into a habit of doing is changing my stroke color from being black to something that will show up regardless what color or tone I have below this. In this case, I'm going to choose more of a bright red. It does take a little getting used to. Sometimes I like to use maybe a darker blue, but this comes in handy whenever I have to turn off my image. I can quickly and easily see it, even if I'm drawing over a dark area like a dark black. So that's why I tend to use red. For mine, I'm also going to bump up my profile or my width of my line. Let's see, in this case about 2 or 3 points tends to work okay. And I'm going to change the profile of it from uniform to this width profile number 1. This way, whenever I make a stroke or a line, it'll look something like this. Now, what I'm looking for whenever I draw these kinds of lines is basically any hard or defining edge. In this case, something like this. What I'm not going to do is try to do every single little line or every small little detail. That'll be way too much for a cartoonish kind of drawing. But if I can see a basic edge like that, that's where I'll go in and I'll draw it. Because I've gotten smoothing turned on, this will give me much smoother strokes depending on what I need, especially once it's nice and small. Another thing to do is to play around with your broken line. For instance, you can see on the eyeball here, I didn't, because of the little highlight that's here, I didn't close off that circle. So having, instead of one continuous line, breaking it up and letting your eye do a little bit of the work also works well. I can do the same for this edge with this one. So I can break the line and draw something that's right here. Every once in a while, I may need to change up my width profile. For instance, if I was to draw off this line, it tends to be a little bit too thick in my opinion. So I'm going to go up to my stroke and set my stroke to be about half the size that it was, down to 1 point size. And I think that looks a little bit better. Of course, you can always Command Z to undo, and that will get rid of that particular part, or undo what you did last time. So if I see any major or larger strokes like this one, we'll bump my profile up to be 2 points. We'll draw that off. If I see any minor strokes, for instance, if I wanted to do some of the hair that's in his eyebrows, this is again where I'm using a broken line. And I'm going through and giving myself just a basic idea of what it looks like. Now as his hair transitions, it gets a little bit darker here, so maybe I'll bump that up to either 1, sometimes I'll even type in 1.5 to do those. If I need to test and see what my drawing looks like at any time, I can always go over to my Layers panel, turn off the visibility of it, and I can go back and see what this looks like. In this case, maybe I'll even bump down the size of my stroke to be half a point for some of these thinner lines. Again, you don't have to do every single hair. I just want to get a good idea of what his eyebrow would look like with that as well. Let's bring it back up to 1 point. Take this one part at a time, going back up to 2 points. Here's a good thicker stroke. And try to get just all of the major portions of the face. You can use broken lines, or you can use complete lines, depending on what you have. Maybe that needs to be a little bigger. Because that's in shadow, I used a thicker line. Bump this down to a 1 point for a thinner line. And there's an edge of his line for here. Same way for the eyebrows that I'm working through. I've got thicker eyebrows and I've got a few thinner eyebrows. So for these, maybe we'll keep them at a 1 point. But as it starts to get thicker, we'll bump it up to a 2 point. And I'm looking to just get a general idea of the flow of Turn that off. Maybe I think all those are a little bit too thick. The best part about Illustrator is I can now go in and select all of these lines, and I can give them a consistent line of, say, 1 point. Oops, let's reselect the stroke up at the top, type in a 1. That changes them all now to be one single point. Now, to create things like hair, or if you have a beard, it can be a little bit tricky. The main thing to keep in mind is we don't want to try to draw off every single individual hair. Instead, try to think of it in chunks of lights and darks and shadows, and giving a sense of the direction that the hair is going. So for instance, if I'm looking at the side of his hair right here, I could break this up into several different lines. I could draw off, say, this edge in one line, and then maybe give an indication that it's going back down this way, another broken line. Same way with the fuzzy edge that's on the left side here. So what this can be done, I'm going to bring my stroke down just a bit. Let's make these a little bit smaller, maybe 1 point. Just giving an indication that it's going in this direction, and then it's a broken line. So I'm squinting my eyes and I'm looking for these kind of shadow shapes. And as I draw off, those are the shapes that I'm wanting to create and the line work that I'm wanting to give. Just going back and forth. I'm not drawing off every single hair. Again, I'm just wanting to give an indication of where the hairline may be. Now to check it out, I can turn off and then turn back on. Later on in this process, we're going to be going in and adding the final shadows and highlights as part of your project. But the whole purpose of this exercise is to give an indication through line where the edges may be. Now, as I reach a darker area over here, this is where I may want to use a thicker line, simply to indicate that the area is getting either denser or has darker shadows, or otherwise the tonal shift in the hair. Again, just a few indicating the outline of the black, but I'm not drawing off every single hair. Turning it off, you can see the transition goes from one edge to the other. And let's finish out with this edge too. Do feel free to add your own style, your own way of doing this. There we have our final hair rendering, maybe a few more in this area. The main thing to keep in mind is that we didn't use any solid blocks of color. We just want to give an indication through line, the direction of the hair and the position and location of any darker type values. Now I can go in, I'm using a thinner line and adding in some smaller details where the darker shadows are on the right side of his face. and also a little bit on the left. Turn it off, turn it back on until I get the density that I like. Same way that we practiced in using in the eyebrows. Now let's see if we can tackle his beard. As with the hair for the beard, we want to do the same thing, indicating darker side using the darker strokes and a lighter side using thinner strokes on this side. And we only want to indicate the direction that the beard is going, and we're also looking for little shadows. Now for his beard, since this one is a bit more wiry, there aren't as many larger shadow shapes, but they are there. As it gets thinner, I can use even a thinner, maybe a half a point stroke for parts that are up here. So feel free to vary the width of your line. That's one of the key successful tips for this kind of style, this kind of product, but also keep turning on and off the visibility of your photograph. All right, now that I've roughed in everything, let's back out and look at the picture as a whole. Especially when comparing it to the photographic image, this is where I can now go in and start to find any areas that I think may need to be cleaned up or otherwise well defined. Keep in mind, we only want this to be a line or a linear outline. We don't want to have any solid filled in objects. We're going to do that part next when we go into Photoshop and start to add all the details and the highlights and shadows, but that's going to be part of your project grade. For this one, I simply want you to practice creating a good, simple outline of your entire character. What I'm doing now is going back in with a very thin line and to define some of the shadowed edges, like I know it's going to be darker up here, I'm making it denser with denser lines by using a small, thin line to follow along and fill in some of the darker areas that are within this area. And we can do the same thing within the beard. In this case, I'll make the line a little bit thicker, up to 1 point. Maybe even see what it looks like with the 2 point. And then go in with a few darker, thicker lines to darken in the beard with this one. It does take a little bit of a steady hand because you don't want to have too many. You simply want to give an indication of where the lights and darks may be. This is where turning on your reference will come in handy. I think that may be a bit too much. Going back down to a thinner line, putting a few in over here, just until it thickens up. And once you've finished up all the major features of just the face, you don't have to do any part of the neck or the body. We can go up to File, and let's do this as a save. We're going to call this our face trace. We'll resave this as Ivy Face Trace. Do make sure it's saved as an Illustrator document. The format should be Adobe Illustrator. I'll save mine where I can find it. When it brings up the Illustrator options, you can keep the default Illustrator options that tend to come up. We'll say OK to this. And this Illustrator file is what you'll upload to Moodle once you finish.